Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation on why we should abolish the Electoral College and how to do it. I'm Elizabeth Bennion, and I'm Director of Voter Services of the League of Women Voters of the South Bend area. And I begin with an acknowledgement to the League of Women Voters of Illinois and their local chapters, because many of the slides you will see today were created by the League of Women Voters of Illinois. They are taking the lead nationally in this initiative to educate the public about the Electoral College and to make the case that the League has been making for 50 years that the college should in fact be abolished. Our mission as a League of Women Voters is to empower voters and to defend democracy. And that's why this talk is about disempowering voters and undermining or threatening democracy. And we argue that the Electoral College does this. So the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization, and it promotes informed and active participation in government, increases understanding of public policy issues, and advocacy through education and advocacy. The League is a natural home for the movement to abolish the Electoral College because the League is about making democracy work better for everyone. The League is specifically and proudly nonpartisan, which means that it can do work to improve our democracy without partisan rancor and can help unite people around a common purpose. It has a national reach and is a trusted voice, and it has over 500 local leagues across the nation that are comprised of citizens and residents like us working to improve our democracy. This is a photo of the League of Women Voters of the South Bend area, just a few of our members, at a resolution celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, recognizing the right of women to vote in all states in the United States, and giving them that right by the Constitution. And this was a joint session before the St. Joseph County Council, the City of Mishawaka, and the City of South Bend. We have been actively visiting many businesses and working with many community organizations to get voters registered and educated and engaged during this election year. We never tell anybody how to vote, but we do ask people to cast their ballots and do what we can to make sure that people are able to cast their votes and also that those votes will count. And that's a big concern that we have with the Electoral College. When voters recommends changes to our election system that will increase fair and representative participation in our democracy, from issues such as voter information and registration to candidate selection and election procedures. Today, we'll talk about how the Electoral College damages our democracy and how and why the League is working to abolish it in favor of direct popular vote for electing the president and the vice president. The League adopted this position in 1970 and most recently reaffirmed it and moved it into our high priority action items in the 2020 National Convention. Now, why did the framers of the Constitution create the Electoral College? This is an important question because you often hear people say, well, if it's in the Constitution, then we should keep it. And this is an important discussion, and it could take up several book chapters and take up several weeks of discussion. But what I will do in this presentation is distill it into a few essential elements as understood by scholars who've tried to answer this question. So the framers' most important consideration was that they wanted to limit the potential for corruption and concentration of power and to maintain independence between the executive and legislative branches. Therefore, they wanted a method other than having Congress select the president, which was the method originally suggested by the delegates. And as you think about the separation between powers, a separated institution sharing powers, or sometimes we call it a separation of power, right? You want one branch to be able to check the other. It's difficult to do that if your Congress is actually selecting your president directly. There are also some logistic reasons why a popular vote was not the chosen method, despite the fact that it really was the favored method by many people there trying to make these decisions. So why not just elect the president directly? Some of the Constitution's framers worried that large distances and lack of communication would make the people uninformed, or certainly not informed enough about the candidates and unlikely to choose the best person. They worried that people could be easily misled or would simply vote for a candidate based on which state they lived in. For example, preferring somebody from their own state. They wanted some kind of an intermediary system. So the other concern logistically was there were concerns about how to hold this new nation together, right? To create a document that would actually be passed by both the northern and southern states. And so pragmatically, there was this ongoing tension between northern and southern states. And as the framers tried to create this new constitution, right, replacing the Declaration, replacing the Articles of Confederation, the slaveholding states did not necessarily want direct election because they wanted their enslaved people to count as 3/5 of a person in determining the number of electors that the state received. Now, remember, if you have taken American politics recently, or you remember back to your civics classes, this is the math used to determine the number in the House of Representatives. The 3/5 compromise says that slaves would count for 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation and taxation. So having electors like the Electoral College, where you have a number of electors based on your total number of representatives in Congress, the House and the Senate, so an extra 2 for the Senate, but plus the whole House, means that you would artificially boost the voting representation of the slaveholding states, just as in Congress, because they didn't actually have that many voters who were being represented, right? But yet they got credit, if you were, political credit for them. So whereas a direct popular vote would only count the number of people who could vote, which of course, they did not include enslaved people. This is also at the heart of the argument that this is not a sort of ethical choice. It is a political compromise to hold the nation together for logistic reasons and political reasons. Now, Thomas Jefferson preferred a direct popular vote, but he worried that the slaveholding states would not accept this. The father of the Constitution, James Madison, also expressed his preference for a national popular vote for president at a speech in the convention, arguing that the people really were the fittest to choose the president. The people at large were the fittest. But he recognized that such a system would put southern states, including his native Virginia, at an electoral disadvantage. Now, Madison believed that local consideration should give way to a general interest, and he was willing to make the sacrifice of his state's political power for the good of the American democracy. One person, one vote, rather than trying to over-represent those few voters in his state. But ultimately, his idea would not prevail. So in fact, evidence suggests that there was a lot of discussion and confusion and changing of minds during the process of figuring out the election system. It was one of the last issues discussed at the exhausting, long, hot, contentious convention, and fatigue and impatience may well have played a role in its adoption. It had broad but unenthusiastic support and seemed like the best they could do at the time, the second choice of many, but the first choice of few, with little idea of how it would play out in reality. One historian has called it a jerry-rigged improvisation. So most of the framers did intend for the selection of the president to be based on the popular wishes of the citizenry. And the electoral system was a sort of intermediary system intended to breach the difficulties of distance and communication. James Madison considered the electoral system to be the next best thing to direct selection, saying the president is indirectly derived from the choice of the people. However, there is also some evidence that they expected the electors to exercise their own discretion in the selection of the president as a bulwark against corruption and bias and information. Remember, this is a time at which the framers also chose not to directly have people directly elect their US senators. Right? There was mistrust in common people. And of course, African Americans, women, Native Americans were not given full citizenship or voting rights. So there was a type of anti-democratic sentiment that existed alongside this idea of creating a democracy and with liberty, right? And so this has always been one of these challenges in thinking about US history. But as we think about how things have evolved over time, of course, we've seen movements in the Constitution toward more and more democracy, expanding the franchise to include non-property holding whites, African Americans, women, Native Americans, etc. So as we think back then to the framers, the electors, and how they thought it might work, that's not how it actually has worked in practice. The electors have almost always acted as a rubber stamp on the votes of the people, with very few exceptions. And in those instances where an elector has voted differently than the state's voters dictated, they have generally met with a great deal of protest and anger. An exception might be the DC elector who cast a blank ballot to protest DC, the lack of DC statehood, right? But in general, these electors are chosen for their party loyalty and they vote the way that the party wants them to vote. Because one thing that's important to know about that Electoral College is they never actually meet as a college, and they're not a single college. Each party has a slate of electors. So in Indiana, we have 9 congressional districts plus 2 senators. That gives us 11 members of Congress, which means that we have 11 electors. And all of those electors go to whichever party wins. Well, they're not just 11 electors. The Republicans have 11, the Democrats have 11, depending who wins the state. Those are the electors that go to the state capitol to actually cast their votes. And so because those people are chosen for their party loyalty, they seldom become what we call a faithless elector. So the people expect the electors to be a rubber stamp on the will of the people and have never really been interested in having them exercise their own discretion. More broadly, not only did it not work out quite as the framers intended, but none of the framers' concerns about logistics are really relevant today. Information is widely available to citizens. Citizens are able, if they choose, to become informed about the candidates, no matter where they live. The framers' concern about the corruption and concentration of power that would come if Congress selected the president is still valid, but nobody is proposing that we move to this system of having Congress select the president. And any notion that we might need electors to exercise their own discretion to overturn a poor decision by the people has really just not been borne out over time. The people don't want this, and the electors have not functioned in this way. So why then does the League of Women Voters take the position that we should abolish the Electoral College? It's really very simple. It comes down to the concept of one person, one vote. The unintended result of the Electoral College is to put the choice of president and vice president into the hands of voters in only a few so-called battleground states or swing states. You may recognize some of these heavy hitter swing states on your screen. These are the states that you hear about in the US presidential elections. Iowa, Ohio, Nevada, Florida are 4 of our well-known swing states. And they are among about 19 states that receive pretty much all of the campaign visits from the presidential candidates, particularly if we look at 2008, but also 12, 16, right? We will have anywhere between 11 states and 19 states that pretty much get all the attention, ads, and visits during the general election. Meanwhile, states like Indiana that are considered safe states for a Republican candidate, with the exception of 2008, with a terrible recession, with over 25% of people unemployed in Elkhart, right next to where we are here in South Bend, when people were desperately looking for change and Obama fought hard in the state. 2008, and 1964 are the only times that the state has gone blue. And because of the winner-take-all system that the state has selected as a way to implement the Electoral College, that means all 11 of our votes go to the winner. That means if I am a Democrat and I only expect to get 40% of the vote, it's not worth my time because I'll get 0 electoral votes from campaigning in Indiana. Even if I get 45, campaign super hard and get 49 in a 2-party race, I'm still out of luck. So it wasn't worth my effort. And so most of the states are this way, and I can just ignore them. So this idea that states can get more attention through the Electoral College just is not true in practice. Now you might ask, so what? In the age of television and smartphones, we can easily watch candidate speeches and candidate debates, no matter where they make them. And we can get the highlights from any number of news outlets. And that's true. But the problem with this system goes well beyond our ability to hear what the candidates have to say. Part of the League's core mission is to encourage the informed and active participation in citizens in government. As such, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Electoral College system is that it creates a disincentive to vote for citizens living in non-battleground states. People who live in these safe states or non-battleground states sometimes feel like it's not worth bothering to pay attention because their vote won't make a difference anyway. Yes, technically it's a state-by-state competition, but they know which way their state will go, and they know that they'll get 0 electoral votes, even if they can increase the number of people who vote the way they do. And this is a majority of people in our country living in these so-called safe states. So if you live in Illinois or Mississippi, why should you bother going out on a cold or rainy day to vote when you know your state is going to go blue or red anyway? Now consider Indiana. As I mentioned just a minute ago, Indiana joined the Union in 1816, but it has been primarily Republican throughout the history. And if we look just at the Electoral College, it would be considered the reddest state in the Midwest. Since 1940, it's voted Democrat in 1964, and then again in 2008. Now, of course, what I like to remind people is that there are other elections on the ballot. And of course, people should vote for governor and their state legislators and their county council and county commission candidates. And the League actively tries to inform people through public forums, candidate debates, our Vote 411 online voter guide, where people can compare the candidates on these issues. But we know that people are more likely to turn out in presidential elections. And we also know they're more likely to turn out in those presidential elections if there is actually competition in their state. The data from 2016, for example, bear this out. In the graph, you can see that the percentage of eligible voters who cast a vote for president was significantly lower in non-swing states, states that aren't particularly competitive, where we pretty much know whether they will go red or blue, in comparison to the swing states where we're still guessing and constantly polling to see how that state might vote. The Electoral College decreases participation in our democracy, and that's bad for democracy. It's also bad for other candidates down ballot because the full electorate is not coming out and making their voice heard, and so they may be getting fewer votes than they would otherwise if they could make their own case instead of riding the president's coattail or being punished for being in a safe state and having their voters not come out even if they like a particular local candidate. Another significant negative effect of the Electoral College system is that it polarizes our electorate and exaggerates our sense of being a divided nation, a nation of red versus blue. And anybody paying any attention to politics today knows what a big problem this type of polarization is, particularly when we start thinking of people in the other party as enemies. Negative partisanship, what political scientists call negative partisanship, is driving so much political behavior. That means people go to the polls because they loathe the other party or they fear the other party, not particularly because they feel strongly about the policy positions of their own. So did you know that in Alabama in 2016, 35% of voters chose Hillary Clinton, or that 32% of California voters chose Donald Trump? That is a lot of people. That is not a fringe minority, but a significant portion of the population of these states. And these are two solidly red or solidly blue states. So what about Colorado, where 43% of voters went for Trump, or Georgia, where 46% went for Clinton? It doesn't matter. And most of us might assume that 5 or 10% of the people in those states voted for those candidates. We don't recognize how truly purple, how truly mixed these states are. When you look at this map, all you see is red or blue, right, left, black, white, everything's just simplified. There are no centrists, there is no complicated middle ground, there is no reason to even talk to people in the state who don't think the way you do. So what if the election simply looked like this? Two numbers, both very large, even in the most lopsided of victories. Those of you who are my age or older might remember the Reagan versus Mondale race in 1984. You may remember it as the most lopsided electoral college victory in modern history, which it was. But you probably don't remember that more than 37 million people voted for Walter Mondale, 41% of the voters. That is not a trivial number, and it highlights the way the Electoral College simply erases the diversity of opinions in our democracy. Because when we see it through the Electoral College, almost all of those so-called blue states are utterly forgotten and erased. Where did all of those Mondale voters go? They're gone. They just don't exist. All we see is 525 to 13, the Electoral College outcome. If we began to see election results like this, we might begin to see ourselves as part of a unified democracy, choosing our leader together, no matter where we live. Might we become more open to diverse, complicated opinions among our neighbors and fellow citizens, more willing to live among people who disagree with us? Imagine if instead of seeing ourselves as a collection of red and blue states, we simply saw ourselves as Americans, a nation of people seeking to balance and to promote shared values of liberty, equality, and self-rule, a people trying to form a more perfect union and seeking to establish justice and promote the public good. Now, the results of two recent elections point us, of course, to another serious problem with the Electoral College, which is that it can lead to a presidential winner who did not receive a majority of the votes. This has happened 5 times in our history, and it's the main reason most people find the Electoral College troubling. So you may have heard somebody say, yes, 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 all of this is true, but here's why the Electoral College still makes sense. So let's walk through some of the most common myths and misperceptions about what the Electoral College does and does not accomplish, what it was meant to do, and how it is impacting our democracy. These are not just fringe theories, by the way. These are the main points that supporters of the Electoral College use to defend this antiquated system. And I would argue, and the League argues, that none of them actually stands up under scrutiny. So myth number 1, without the Electoral College, our president would all be chosen by a couple of big states like California, New York, and Texas. Let's run through the numbers to see how it would actually play out in an election by a national popular vote. Let's say, for the sake of this example, that every state in the union voted 60% to 40% for the same candidate, an absolute landslide, an unbelievably strong preference for one candidate. And let's see how many states it would take to get us over the 50% threshold to victory if we elected the president by the national popular vote total, going in order from the largest states down to the smallest. So again, the question is, right, can just a small little handful of states elect the president? Well, California has the most voters, and 60% of its voters would represent 7% of the national total. Next is Texas, so we'll add it to the total. Remember, in this example, we have a strong majority of 60% of voters choosing the same candidate in every state. So we're seeing how long it would take for that candidate to get more than 50% of the votes. Now we add Florida, here's New York, we add Pennsylvania, now Illinois, and we're still not even halfway there. Let's add half a dozen more states and see where we get. In fact, it would take the votes of 27 states to get us over the 50% threshold, even in this incredibly lopsided scenario. In reality, of course, California and Texas might go for different candidates and in essence cancel each other out. And the margins of victory would likely be much smaller in many of these states, which means that it would take even more states' voters to get us to 51%. So the fact is that it's simply mathematically impossible for an election by popular vote to be determined by just a few large states or only a few large cities. The fact is that direct election by popular vote would ensure that every person is equally represented regardless of where they live. Voters from swing states would count just the same as voters from non-swing states. Voters from the city would count just the same as voters from the country. A California Republican's vote would count just the same as a California Democrat's vote. We wouldn't have people feeling completely unheard and unrepresented. And in fact, mathematically, there would be one person, one vote, political equality. So let's look for a minute specifically at California, where the presidential vote is split just as it is in all states. We think of it as a blue state, but there are an awful lot of Republicans in California. 32% of California went for Donald Trump in 2016. Once the state's votes were totaled, all 4.5 million of those Trump voters were erased. Why should only a portion of the state's votes count in choosing the president of all people? 4.5 million voters simply erased in one state. Now, the national popular vote system would mean that those votes would be added to the national total along with the votes from all other states, regardless of who got the most in each state, and regardless of whether that state was big or small. The fact that we no longer would be voting by state, but by person, means that this would be more democratic with a small d, more representative. So a California voter would get no more say in our presidential election than a voter from Mississippi, Rhode Island, Kansas, or any other state. This is the process that many people think is most fair. And it is what the framers intended when they agreed with Madison's statement that the president is supposed to act for the people and not for the states. So myth number 2, smaller, less populated states need the protection of the Electoral College. This is another one we hear frequently. They need the protection of the Electoral College to ensure their interests are represented by the president. On first glance, you see how this argument gets made. Remember, if you're a small state and you have only one congressional district, you'll still have 3 electoral votes because you have your total number in Congress, the 1 congressional district in the House, plus the 2 senators. So you're getting 300 times your power. Versus California, you have 54 congressional districts and then 2 senators, 56. You're not magnifying your vote 3 times, right? So the idea there seems to make sense. These small states, they need to be represented as states. But the fact is, there is no coherent small state or large state interest that needs protecting. All of our states have diverse interests. The fact is that there is no coherent interest like this because all of us should be represented. And even the small state has substantial diversity within it. It is a fallacy to suggest that when a state goes red or blue, this represents the interests of everybody in that state. So let's take an example. Farmers are often mentioned. Well, the concerns of a farmer are likely to be very different from those of a computer programmer, whether they live in New Hampshire, Nebraska, or any other small state. Small states represent a great diversity of economic interests, and they share many of these interests with large states. For example, agriculture. Most farmers live in states with large populations, such as Texas, Florida, California, and Illinois, and they share economic interests with farmers from smaller states all over the country. People will conflate small state with rural state, with agriculture, forgetting how many farmers live in Texas and Florida and California. The great political battles of American history have been fought between opposing ideologies and economic interests. We've also had some north, south, right, historically slave free states, but not between large states and small states wherever they may be. There's no coherent small state interests, we argue, that needs protecting by the Electoral College. The representation of small states is a myth because representatives of small states do not vote as a bloc in Congress, and their citizens do not vote in a bloc for president. There's no evidence that small states and large states have different political interests. We can look at the numbers. The numbers from the 2016 election show this emphatically. The smallest 1/3 of states, those with fewer than 6 electoral votes, did not all go for the same candidate. In fact, they were exactly evenly split, with 8 going for Clinton and 8 going for Trump. Small states do not vote as a bloc, and they do not benefit from the Electoral College. In fact, smaller states are routinely ignored by presidential candidates under the current system. This idea that all small states get lots of extra attention by the Electoral College simply isn't true. Just like bigger states, if they're considered safe rather than swing, if candidates think they know the outcome based on this winner-take-all system in 48 out of the 50 states, they get ignored. Instead, the candidates focus all their time in the so-called swing states that will decide the election. 19 states received all campaign visits from 2 presidential candidates in 2008, virtually ignoring the 31 other states, both large and small. And this is typical. So there's no basis for the myth that smaller, less populated states need the protection of the Electoral College to ensure their interests are represented by the president. And in fact, the Electoral College actually diminishes the rightful representation of the residents of larger states. For example, Virginia's population is almost 9 times larger than Delaware's, but it only gets about 4 times as many electors because electors are based on the number of senators and representatives from each state. Is this fair? Myth number 3. The Electoral College protects the rights of the minority from the tyranny of the majority. Protecting the minority rights is crucial and a critical part of democratic societies. And the Founding Fathers designed our government accordingly. As a result, 2 of our 3 branches of government are designed to ensure the protection of minority rights. The first is the courts. Their role is to ensure the constitutional rights of the individual regardless of the opinion of the majority of citizens. Now, of course, exactly how a court will decide will depend on the composition of those courts, but we have seen historically that the court has often served this role as intended. The second is the Senate, in which every state, regardless of population size, gets 2 representatives. This ensures that Wyoming gets heard just as loudly as New York, even though more people live in New York. So to the extent that we want states to be represented as states because of our history under the Articles of Confederation, because we are the United States of America, that type of representation is happening already in the Senate. We don't protect the minority by giving them outsized political power. We protect the rights of minority groups and individuals through our Bill of Rights, through our courts, through our laws. Our votes should all count equally. The president is supposed to represent the interests of all Americans as fairly and equally as possible. That means one person, one vote. And if you think about it, what does the tyranny of the majority mean when it comes to the selection of a single executive? By what logic can we argue that it makes sense for a minority of the electorate to overrule the majority of the electorate when determining who should represent all of us as president? This is a type of tyranny of the minority, and it violates the fundamental idea of representative democracy, which is rule of the majority, rule of the many, and one person, one vote. Myth number 4, abolishing the Electoral College will mostly benefit Democratic candidates or only benefit one party. Let me give you an example of why this is not the case. Modern analysis shows in 1960 that Republican Richard Nixon actually won the popular vote by about 48,000 votes over Democrat John Kennedy. This is the Electoral College map for the 2004 election, where George Bush won over John Kerry with 3 million more popular votes. But if John Kerry, the Democrat, had received only 119,000 more votes in Ohio, he would have won the Electoral College and thus the election, even though Bush would still have nearly 3 million more popular votes. So there are several scenarios in which it may benefit a Democrat or benefit a Republican, just depending on how those votes are distributed in any particular year. On a more personal level, let's get back to a consideration of what happens to individual Democrats and Republicans who don't live in swing states. What about the Republican voter in so-called blue Vermont or the Democratic voter in so-called red Kansas? Neither of these voters feels that their vote for president counts, and this is a disincentive for them to vote, and it is bad for democracy. This system can and has affected both parties. This is a nonpartisan issue. The concern about making it politicized or becoming partisan is the reason that some politicians, like South Bend's own former mayor Pete Buttigieg, argued that perhaps it should be abolished, but have it take effect a few decades later when it'd be even less clear which party it would benefit. So how would we abolish the Electoral College? Well, for those who believe that we should have an equal voice with every person having one vote toward the presidency instead of some people's votes counting more because of all of the other votes getting thrown out when a state gives all their electoral votes to one candidate or the other, there are some things that we can do. The League of Women Voters supports a constitutional amendment that would replace the Electoral College with the direct election of the president. In theory, it's quite simple. Congress passes an amendment, and then 38 states are needed to ratify it. This process is laid out in the US Constitution, which requires 2/3 of each chamber in Congress, the House and the Senate, to pass an amendment, and 3/4 of the states to ratify it. Such an amendment has been proposed many times, including this year by Representative Steve Cohen of Tennessee. The language is very simple, proposing an amendment to the Constitution of the United States to abolish the Electoral College and to provide for the direct popular election of the President and Vice President of the United States. We need to build a strong, loud, and persistent voice of the people, urging our representatives in Congress to co-sponsor this bill. We need to build momentum to make this an issue that Congress can no longer ignore. Now, getting to a constitutional amendment will nonetheless take time, and it's not going to happen this year. The League of Women Voters is currently focusing on what we're doing today, which is starting discussions about where the Electoral College comes from and how it's bad for our democracy. And perhaps more importantly, we want people to understand that passing a constitutional amendment is possible and it can happen. Many of us probably think that ratifying a new amendment is a thing of the past, something for a bygone era of political unity, a quaint anachronism, if you will. But here's a timeline showing the dates that amendments have been passed after the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments to the US Constitution, were ratified. You can see that our history includes flurries of constitutional activity punctuated by long periods of inactivity. There was a period of 60 years between the first two clumps, and then another gap of 43. There were 18 years between the amendments of the 1930s and 1950s and 60s, then a gap of 21. It's been 26 years since the last constitutional amendment was passed in 1992. So what distinguishes these periods of constitutional activities? Well, they tended to be periods of great national political activity, where the citizens were feeling that our democracy was in crisis, where the demand for change across our society was persistent and loud. There was the period after the Civil War, the Progressive Era, and the turn of the last century, and the Civil Rights era of the 1950s and 1960s. We may be in the middle of another period of political activity, of demand for change. Only time will tell. But the level of activity we're seeing now and the genuine concern about the resilience of our democracy and the survival of our democratic institutions are remarkable. We may be on the verge of adding a 28th Amendment to the Constitution. There are all kinds of battles about whether or not these ratifications are still valid, or did the ratification deadline expire? But the Equal Rights Amendment is another one that gets a lot of talk. It was passed by Congress in 1972, and as of 2 years ago, needed only 3 more states to ratify it in order to become part of the Constitution. In 2017, Nevada ratified it, in 2018, Illinois. So if 1 more state ratifies it, there'll probably be additional legal conversations, but it could be added as the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. Amending the Constitution is not necessarily a thing of the past. It can be a thing of right now. There's a process for doing it, and the process requires that the citizenry make it known to our legislators that we want change. We do that all the time with the legislation. It is time for amendments, so we have to build stronger consensus and a louder voice. This is actually something that I started thinking about early on in life. This is a picture of me and the front page of my local newspaper growing up after a protest against the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment, saying that equality shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. Now, because of the long time frame expected for an amendment to pass and to be ratified, the League also supports an interim measure that would effectively nullify the Electoral College and result in the election of the president by the popular vote, while we continue working toward a long-term constitutional amendment. Some of you may have heard of this. This measure is called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and it would guarantee the president to the candidate who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states, regardless, and also the District of Columbia, I should add, who have 3 electoral votes. It pledges a state's electoral votes to the candidate who wins the national popular vote, and it would not take effect until enacted by states possessing a majority of the electoral votes, or a total of 270. So just to remind everybody, with a little quick refresher, there are 538 electoral votes. They reflect the 435 members of the House of Representatives. They are not the representatives, but they have that same number to give power to population, and then the 100 in the Senate. That's 535. There are also additional 3 for Washington, D.C. That's 538, and you need a majority of electoral votes, 270, to win the college and the presidency. Now, the National Popular Vote Compact then says once we have enough states that if we all agree to vote for the popular vote winner, we will have at least 270 votes, then the compact goes into effect. So the Interstate Compact has been enacted into law in 12 states with 172 electoral votes, and the compact will take effect when enacted by states with 98 more electoral votes. And this is possible because states have a right to decide how they will allocate their electors. So 48 states say winner take all, right? Doesn't matter if 49% of the people in your state voted for one candidate, or even if only one more person voted for one candidate than the other, all of your electoral votes go to the winner. But they don't have to allocate them that way. So they could do it even through a compact like this, which says we're going to pick those electors who reflect the party that received the plurality or the majority of the national popular vote. This is a nonpartisan issue that has been passed by strong majorities in both Republican-controlled and Democratic-controlled state houses and senates, including California, DC, Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Vermont, Washington, and Connecticut. Now, what about proportional representation by state? So I mentioned that we have the ability for each state legislature to decide how to allocate, how to distribute those electors. So why not just get rid of the winner-take-all system, keep the college, and make them more proportional? So instead of giving all 11 of Indiana's Electoral College votes to the winner, say, okay, what was the percentage of votes that went to each candidate, and we'll send that number of electors from each party to our state capital to cast those electoral votes. Or use a congressional district system that's very similar, but the ones representing the House would be, those 9, would each go to a different district, how your congressional district voted. And then the 2 for the overall state winner, right, would go to who won the state, the 2 representing the Senate. So those are other methods that are proposed, and they sound really good. And I will confess that this used to be my preferred solution. It seemed like a great way to balance between the history of having a college and having the United States of America and representation of states as states, and the desire to provide a more democratic process. Right? The Constitution does say that the states are free to assign their electors however they see fit. So winner take all is not the only option. Perhaps this could be a better option, right? So if 40% of Nebraska voters choose candidate A, that candidate would get 2 of Nebraska's 5 electoral votes. And similarly in every other state. The problem is, if we think carefully about how this so-called solution would play out in real life, we find that it may be the least democratic option of all. And again, the word democratic here means with not a capital D, not a Republican Party or Democratic Party option, but democratic, based on popular vote, based on a representative democracy. It may be the least democratic option of all. So the problem with this system is, if it were adopted by every state, it's fairly likely that no candidate would receive the 270 vote majority needed to win. This, according to the Constitution, would send the election of the president into the House of Representatives, where each state, regardless of population, would receive only 1 vote to cast. They vote as delegations by state. This would further remove the election of the president from the will of the people. Now, you're probably scratching your head trying to figure out why this system would make it unlikely that candidates would receive 270 votes. The reason is that we always have more than just 2 parties running for president. There are third parties. Sometimes there are fourth parties and beyond. And if you look at something like Project Vote Smart, sometimes you'll see dozens and dozens of candidates. But it's quite frequent that we have at least one somewhat well-known third party who gets some votes, and sometimes this can be a substantial number. In the 2016 election, votes were actually cast for 31 different candidates, plus a none of the above option in a few states that allow that. So let's run through a quick example with the 1968 election, a closely fought contest between Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, and George Wallace. An unusually strong third party candidate emerged. Now here you can see that Nixon won the popular vote by a thin margin, but easily received the required 270 Electoral College votes under the winner-take-all system. And this is one thing that the Electoral College can do, magnify that margin of victory, apparent margin of victory. So, but what if electoral votes were allocated based on the percentage of popular vote by state? In Kansas, Nixon would have received 4 electoral votes instead of all 7. In Illinois, Nixon would have received 12 instead of 26. In Florida, instead of 14 votes, just 6. And as you can see, Wallace and Humphrey are picking off votes bit by bit in each state. And when you do this for all 50 states, the results of proportional allocation is that there is no winner in the Electoral College. Nixon fails to achieve the required 270 votes. So the election of the president would have been turned over to the House of Representatives with 1 vote per state. The simplest, most permanent solution is to elect the president by direct vote by all citizens of the United States using a 1-person, 1-vote rule. Abolishing the Electoral College would be a common sense solution to update a system that most Americans agree is utterly out of date, confusing, and unfair. It's time to start building the momentum that will once and for all abolish this dysfunctional system of electing our president. Now, this may seem like a daunting task, but remember that we've amended the Constitution to promote democracy in the past. In 1914, we changed the way we elect U.S. senators to allow for direct representation, a direct election by the people. In 1951, we imposed term limits on the presidency. In 1961, we allocated electors to Washington, D.C. In 1964, we prohibited poll taxes. And in 1971, we changed the voting age to 18. All of these amendments affect the way we elect our representatives in Washington. There's no reason that we cannot abolish the Electoral College if we decide to do it. So what can you do now? Well, there are lots of things you can do now. First, you can spread the word. Talk to your friends and family about the Electoral College and the harm it causes and how it can be abolished. Post a presentation or give one yourself to any community group you're a part of. You can find materials at the LWV Willamette website, including scripts and presentation slides and handouts and brochures. Alternatively, you can invite somebody, a speaker you've seen, to give a presentation to groups big and small. Next, you can email the League of Women Voters of Willamette or at abolishelectoralcollege@gmail.com. Or you can like the League of Women Voters of the South Bend area on Facebook, or join the South Bend Area League to stay up to date with all of our events and to volunteer for voter registration, education, mobilization, and advocacy work. Third, you can follow us on Facebook and share our posts on social media. There are lots of things that you can do to spread the word and start creating that national conversation. Fourth, you can talk to your senators and congressional representatives about their views on the Electoral College. If you're seeing a state office holder, ask if they would support their state voting yes to an amendment to abolish the Electoral College. If you attend a candidate forum, you could ask for a candidate's stance on abolishing the Electoral College. We need our legislators to begin hearing from us on this issue, and we need to keep talking about it. And finally, you can donate to the League of Women Voters of the South Bend area or the League of Women Voters of Illinois Electoral College Committee. A donation of any size would demonstrate that this movement has widespread support and will help us to educate voters and grow our impact. I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn on my camera so we can have some Q&A. So Avanis is what would be the legal process for abolishing the Electoral College. And if it were to get into motion, how long could it take to pass and enact? And so it would require a constitutional amendment, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, plus 3/4 of the state. So that's another reason you really would need a lot of public and popular support at both the state and national level, and need people to be talking to their state legislators and their members of Congress about this process to get a lot of buy-in. And that can be a really lengthy process to actually take place. The popular vote compact, the interstate compact, would be quicker and because it would involve only getting a few more states on board. So that might be a temporary measure that would involve lobbying state legislators and building support in key states. Now, she also asked, because it was included in the Constitution, does this mean it would need to go through the Supreme Court? The Constitution provides a process for amending the Constitution. And so if you actually create a constitutional amendment through that process of 2/3 in the House, 2/3 in the Senate, plus 3/4 of the state, right? That is the constitutionally valid way to change the Constitution, just like we did when we lowered the age of voting from 21 to 18, or when we abolished the poll taxes, or in fact, made it so instead of state legislators electing our US senators, we can do it ourselves. And so there has been a movement in this direction. Similarly, the 19th Amendment, 100 years ago, making sure that all women in the country had the right to vote. All of these were through that same process. And so that would be a valid way to do it. And then that would not be something that could be reversed by the Supreme Court. Do you think there's a middle ground that Democrats and Republicans could agree on before completely abolishing the Electoral College? You know, it's an interesting question. I think clearly one thing that people can do is to lobby their state legislators and try to create different systems, more proportional systems. But again, the problem is that there is a real danger there that all it does is skew the math in a strange way, so that unless that 270 is changed, you have this real danger of throwing the election into the House. And then with each state just casting one vote, you could have so few people represented who are actually voting for the next president. And that would really circumvent and be a problem for the public will as a whole and for democracy. And so the solution that really sounds the best in many ways on paper, something that could be easy to do and more democratic, ultimately could be less democratic in terms of looking from a democratic theory perspective. And so I think that is a problem. One of the things is to let Democrats and Republicans know that it's not about partisanship, that it's about principle and democracy. We face the same problem. The League opposes partisan gerrymandering. And depending on which party is in the majority in your state legislature, you often think that this is a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. And that's because the majority party does the gerrymandering to benefit themselves and draw the district line to pack all of the members of the other party in one district so they can take all the surrounding districts and increase their power. And we know in Democratic-led state houses, right, we see that they are disproportionately represented compared to the popular vote. Similarly with Republican. Why does that all of a sudden seem like a Democratic Party issue? Because Republicans control more state houses. So more Democrats support the reform. But when the situation was reversed, it was just the opposite. And so one of the things that the League has done is, regardless if it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party pushing for or against these different reforms that allow one person, one vote and access to the polls, the League for 100 years has held strong and held firm, even as public interest waxes and wanes, as it changes which party has it on the platform or supports or opposes it. And it would be good if people stopped always thinking narrowly about, okay, what does this mean for me? We see similarly with the parties and this question of the Supreme Court justice. Do you appoint in an election year? Well, yes, you absolutely do, or you absolutely don't. Which is it? is it about the person or is it about the principle? Well, it depends who the person is, right? But we say it's a principle. And so we've seen so many people flip on that issue and then it be turned into a partisan issue instead of focusing on the principle of whether or not that timeline makes sense. And so we see a similar thing here with the Electoral College. And so it's educating the public so then members of their own party and the electorate can talk to the public officials and say, hey, this is about basic fundamental fairness in the future of our democracy. Right? We have to stop thinking about our narrow self-interest, as Madison did, right? Virginia will lose some power, but I still want to do what's best for the nation as a whole and represent the popular will. So I would say it's very similar in that way, but that kind of education would be needed. Now, let's see, Benjamin says, do the electors vote twice, once as an elector and once as a citizen? Yes, they can do that because they count separately. One counts toward the popular vote and the other actually counts in the Electoral College. And so they can do that. And again, the electors don't actually meet as a college. They will cast their votes in their state capital. And we did initially have a system that created problems because the second place winner, those of you who've seen Hamilton will know this, became the vice president. And so you can have people who absolutely despise each other having to serve together like Adams and Jefferson, or you can have people tying like Jefferson and Burr, and that just really creates a huge problem. And so now we have one slate of a president and a vice president, and that's who the electorate cast their votes for, either the Democrat or the Republican. So do a majority of legislators support abolishing the Electoral College, and what barriers are faced in abolishing it? I think that a majority do not currently support it. I haven't seen a breakdown by each and every number, but generally speaking, there's resistance to change, particularly in institutions. But we certainly saw a lot more talk about this recently. A lot more public officials, a lot more candidates on debate stages, and a lot more members of the community starting to talk about this, as we had both in 2000 and in 2016, this is not a historical anachronism of the popular vote being overridden by the Electoral College. The other thing is in 2016, with Clinton getting more than 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, that was the largest margin of victory ever where the Electoral College overturned the public will or the number of votes actually cast on or before Election Day. And so that made a lot more people say, this seems fundamentally unfair, regardless of which party it is, to have 3 million more people go and cast a vote for you, and then to have somebody different take the college seems unfair. Now, as a caveat, this candidates did know that this was the system they were playing by, this kind of weird, strange system where the swing states have all the power. And what that means is that they could, they have to strategize accordingly. So the candidates needed to kind of make up for that. Now, would states like California or Texas, who contribute many electoral votes and are traditionally vastly one party, be opposed to abolition of the college? Well, one of the things that's interesting about that is some of those states are underrepresented mathematically by the college. And also, as I noted earlier, there are huge minorities in that state. Texas is now almost like becoming a purple state. There are huge shifts in that state over time due to demographic change. In California, we pretend that there are no conservatives there, but there are huge numbers of Republicans living in California who are ignored. And so those are reasons why, in fact, these states which we think might be most opposed might in fact support one person, one vote fairness. This is what problems could possibly arise in today's day and age if we just had a popular vote. That's a good question. And one thing I would say is that we really would need to think about a majority runoff or a ranked choice voting system, because otherwise you have like a Kanye West come in who's not a serious candidate, but peels off some support. And what people do is a strategic voting. And when they do that, their least favorite choice gets voted. So you put a Democrat and a Green Party candidate, or a Republican and a certain kind of conservative libertarian, and then they get more votes overall, but because the minor parties are forced to be spoilers, then most voters least preferred, the least popular candidate of all can become president. And so if we really wanted to make it more fair, probably a ranked choice voting where people could really vote for the people they want. And then if that candidate doesn't win, say who's my second choice, who's my third choice, would make it the most representative possible instead of allowing for all these spoilers to come in and get a minority candidate elected through popular vote. So we are at 1:14. We advertise 12 to 1. So unfortunately, we may not be able to answer all of your questions. Let's see, how does somebody become an elector? And oh, how do electors get the position? Okay, so I will be able to answer this quickly for those folks still here, which is that it's out of party loyalty. And so the political parties are able to appoint them. And you can be a local elected official, you cannot be a member of Congress. But if you're a party donor, if you're an activist within the party and you're known for your loyalty, that's how you will get in line to become an elector. Okay. Put up the slide again with the list of resources. All right, that's the last question there. And I will do that. And I thank all of you for tuning in. I'll put that up for a few seconds. And then I've got to go moderate a political debate down at WNIT. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Feel free to contact me directly if you have any questions. Take care now.